I'm trapped here. In this nightmare. I write to escape. Every word is a step forward. Into darkness.
The first Alan Wake game, released all the way back in 2010, follows a renowned crime author struggling with burnout and writer's block. Hoping to reignite his creative spark and save his marriage, Alan Wake and his wife Alice take a holiday to a sleepy town called Bright Falls. Only for Alice to be kidnapped by a supernatural menace called the Dark Presence. This sinister force, which feeds on creative energy, grants Alan a typewriter capable of making anything typed on it come true. So he decides to write himself into a story about a writer called Alan Wake and his kidnapped wife, hoping to use the typewriter's powers to engineer his own happy ending.
I've written myself into the story. I'm now the protagonist. This feels like a terrible risk, but it's the only way to save Alice. I'll be bound by the events of the story just as much as anyone else who's been woven into it. The story must stay true for this to work. There have to be victims along the way, near escapes, cliffhangers. In a horror story, it can't be certain that the hero will succeed or even survive. He almost has to die. I'll write my own escape into the story next.
In a dark twist, Alan breaks through his writer's block and straight into a trap. Because the Dark Presence is exerting its own ill will on the final product. If Alan takes too many creative liberties, if he deviates too far from the genre constraints of the horror story he's writing and also living through, he'll meet a grim fate. Alan Wake wasn't just a pulpy story about a man rescuing his damsel from the forces of darkness. It was the story of an artist trapped by his own success, creatively stifled, desperately trying to escape the conventions of his own body of work. It wasn't a masterpiece by any means. It leaned a little too heavily on its inspirations, and the repetitive gameplay couldn't sustain its 8 to 10 hour runtime. But between its more experimental meta elements and its relatively successful exploration of interesting themes, it did a lot more narratively than most other games of the time.
Even though it didn't find a huge audience, it did gain a pretty devoted following among a sizable number of people, myself included. And then, a full 13 years later, came the sequel. And it was easily the best game of 2023.
The first game ends with Alan sacrificing himself to the Dark Presence to save Alice. The sequel opens with Alan still trapped in the dark place, a twisted writer's room from which he can still influence events in the real world through the typewriter. He has spent 13 years trying and failing to make an escape through the pages of his own stories, writing himself into various spine-chilling tales, each time descending further into madness and a perpetual struggle with his evil alter ego, Mr. Scratch. I could attempt to describe the plot points of the game, but that would itself probably drive me to madness. The sections of the game in which you play as FBI agent Saga Anderson, investigating a series of strange events in the town of Bright Falls, is straightforward enough. But then there's the Alan Wake sections of the game, in which you play Alan Wake the character in his own wild, ever-changing book drafts, and Alan Wake the writer trapped in a haunted writer's room, storyboarding those same drafts in real time and losing his mind as he does so. These shape-shifting stories are set in a dark, distorted version of New York, haunted by the shadows of Alan's past, his worst fears for his wife, his laughably dramatic professional insecurities, and his rapidly fragmenting grip on reality.
And here I struggle to even describe what it's like to play through these sections. They're gorgeous, horrific, hilarious, and completely bonkers. A recursive, genre-bending spectacle where fiction and reality are indistinguishable, and anytime you think you have a grip on what the hell is happening, it quickly slips away.
Events loop, but play out differently each time. Alan constantly enters images and projections, but doesn't exit them again, leaving you baffled as to which layer of fiction you're currently in. And even if you were keeping track, objects and people from one layer inexplicably show up in others anyway. To give just one example, in this sequence, you warp into the draft of your book, titled Initiation, and then immediately warp into a fictional talk show within that story, which turns out to be a promo for the book, which Alan doesn't remember writing because he hasn't. In another loop of this same sequence, you find yourself sharing the couch with an actor slated to portray Detective Alex Casey, the protagonist of your crime novels, in a film adaptation which doesn't exist. But no sooner have you left the set than you run into Alex Casey, the character. And in the real world, there's also an FBI agent called Alex Casey who looks and sounds exactly the same. And in the actual real world, they're all played by Sam Lake, the head of the development studio that made the game.
It's just stupid. And I love it so much.
One would not be wrong for finding all of this a little too self-indulgent and choosing to exit the nightmare through the nearest door. Cards on the table, I'm usually one of those people. I don't tend to vibe with absurd postmodern stories that are so wrapped up in showcasing how clever the writers are that the characters get chewed up and spat out in the process. This is why my favourite David Lynch film is the least David Lynch film David Lynch ever made, because it's the only one where I ever actually gave a shit about the characters or anything that was happening to them. For a while there, it was a toss-up as to whether I would end up loving this game or wanting to put a magic bullet straight through its skull. Eventually, though, the tangled threads of this game's narrative hooked me deeper and deeper, and curiosity became delight, became sheer obsession, which has had me in its grips for over a year now.
And I'm making this video to try and explain why.
Okay, first things first. This game is just frickin' cool. The locations are evocative, the set pieces go hard, the game is constantly pulling these neat little visual tricks on you, and Remedy Entertainment have gone above and beyond to find ways to frame the action immaculately. I mean, just look at this shot. Look at it! Despite being heavy on narrative, there are sections that could be played without context and still be some of the slickest, funnest gaming experiences of 2023, including this climactic battle against the legions of darkness on a stormy beach while a vortex is being summoned by the forces of live rock. There's the way Alan flicks a light, and the world shifts. There's the scene changes, when you rewrite a scene you're also currently in, and it changes before your eyes. Goosebumps every time. You can appreciate these delicious artistic flexes no matter how invested you are, or aren't, in the rest of the story. I also adore the way the themes of the story are echoed in the player experience. As Alan and Saga are pulled deeper into the nightmare, so are you. As they wonder aloud, what the hell is happening?
Come on, what is this?
This is ridiculous.
So do you. The game is about being trapped in infinite loops, and New Game Plus is diegetically another loop, in which when you replay the game, it changes ever so slightly, mentioning plot revelations from the first playthrough to make you feel like you're stuck in a repeating and yet slightly changing cycle. A spiral, if you will.
I can't get over the fact that Alan Wake 2, a game about madness, requires you to go a little bit mad in order to enjoy it. Because the plot of this game is so labyrinthine and ridiculous that to follow what happens in it, you need to burn out any real-world logic left inside you and give yourself over to the infinite depths of insanity.
If your way into a hotel is barred by an infinitely looping lobby, find another way in. If Alan accidentally kills another version of himself thinking it was his evil doppelganger because the dark place functions in loops and sometimes they intersect, then that's what happened, okay? I know I've called this game complete nonsense, and I do think it is. But also, it's not. Like, it's undeniable that there are rules of a kind propelling this dark universe, just not ones that in any way resemble those found in the real world, or even most works of film or literature. The universe of Alan Wake is governed by dream logic that you have no choice but to just go with. Certain words and objects, torches, light switches, magic bullets, have a ritualistic power because, well, they just do. A filmmaker shares your face because your roles in the first game were similar? It makes a kind of sense. After all, there's a man with a magic typewriter out there that can make literally anything happen. So who are you to say what is or isn't possible?
Is this bad writing? Or is it sheer madness? And isn't madness really the only truth there is? No, but playing Alan Wake 2 will put these kinds of thoughts into your mind as you get swept up in the spectacular whimsy of it all. For better or worse, Remedy's games do have a way of taking up residence in my brain in a way very few games have ever done.
Most of all, though, I love how this game is a story about stories that explicitly calls attention to and plays with its own genre constraints, just like the first game did. Alan has a magic typewriter where anything he writes becomes reality, but also not really, because the dark magic lending him these powers demands that his art must follow the rules of literature. He cannot write an unsatisfying story. The plot conceit of Alan Wake is literally, well, we're in a video game here, guys, and you don't want the main character to just go, and then I waked up and it was just a dream, do you? Even if it would be reading too far into it to say that this is a reflection of Remedy's real-life limitations of wanting to make an oddball game but being constrained by the expectations of the action-adventure genre, the commentary that the game makes on the hardships and torments of the creative process are clever, self-reflective, and meaningful.
Alan's struggles are relatable, even to those who haven't achieved anywhere near his level of success and fame. I've been struggling with something uncannily similar this last year, a writer's block that comes from feeling kind of trapped. In case you were wondering why I haven't released a proper video essay in 7 months, this is why. The style of video I've found some success with over the past 5 years doesn't inspire me anymore. But I'm also scared of breaking with the brand and potentially disappointing the people who follow my work by doing something different. Most people doing creative stuff long enough have probably experienced this, and I find the depiction of it in these games really resonant.
If Alan Wake 1 was a game about being hopelessly trapped by the conventions of genre, Alan Wake 2 is about transcending those conventions. If not entirely, then much more successfully. Is Alan Wake 2 a horror? A comedy? A musical? Is it a classic Resi-inspired survival horror game? A series of short films? A narrated work of literature? A modern action-adventure shooter? A game that contains a 20-minute long movie you can watch all the way through, starring a fictional detective from a book series that he becomes self-aware of in the draft of a different book that's actually the story you're playing through? Somehow, it's all of the above.
How can this exist in the same game as this?
Somehow, it can and it does. And as we're grappling with all these tone shifts and plot convolutions, Alan Wake, the one typing it all to life on a magic typewriter, is winking at us, showing that he too sees how ridiculous this all is.
I'm my own Deus Ex Machina? Really?
And Remedy are winking at us through his eyes, saying, yeah, isn't this all a bit ludicrous?
Everything about this was absurd. Our dialogue forced and ridiculous. In desperate need of another pass. But I'd play along to see where it took me.
It bears mentioning that even beyond the Alan Wake games, this meta-ness is something of a calling card for Remedy Entertainment. Their games are known for referencing their own artifice and each other, and encouraging you to step outside the frame and remember that this is all a bit of fun.
Looking back, I can pinpoint the moment I clicked with Alan Wake 2. And that's the moment when it turns into a rock musical. Specifically, a rock musical about itself, the characters recapping the events and themes of the first game through song and dance, in what has become one of my all-time favourite video game sequences.
Just one shot, one more chance for him to save their marriage.
After 7 to 8 hours of gameplay, I got it. I felt like Remedy had finally given me the brief for how to view their game. As an in-joke. We aren't Alan, although we play as him and we may be as confused as he is at times. Alan knows he's in a story, and we know he's in a story, but we also know more than him. That his story within a story is in fact also within a video game. During that musical sequence, I realised that if I wanted to avoid being left on the outside of the in-joke, I had to accept, even embrace, all of it. The wild plot convolutions, the moon logic of time loops and living shadows, the magical objects and Deus Ex Machinas, the shameless schlock of it all. And once I jumped on board and stopped trying to take it all too seriously, this ride took me places I never wanted to leave.
I'm Zane. Welcome to the House of Zane.
Every new plot twist pulled me in further. Every flight of fancy was another invitation to join Alan down the rabbit hole of absurdity. The more shit it threw at me, the more I exclaimed, "What?" And then laughed, and then pushed deeper. Did I mention this game is funny?
And we don't do just Deerfest. Our floats are a perfect gift for weddings, birthdays, bar mitzvahs, or your scenario.
Some of the biggest laughs came while I was collecting extracts of Alan Wake's hard-boiled detective novels, which had me literally rolling on the couch with laughter.
A murder in the backdrop of a play featuring a murder cult. How meta can you get? He said, looking knowingly at the camera.
You can call these meta elements obnoxious or self-indulgent, and I won't argue with you. But there's so much of what gives the game its unique flavour of zaniness. And for me, they opened up whole new avenues of delight. The chance to feel like I'd been invited to some raucous party hosted by Sam Lake and his team of eccentric writers. And they do want you to join the party. I mean, the game's signature musical number comes with a dance that was clearly choreographed to be so simple, any idiot with too much enthusiasm and not enough self-respect could do it. The more I think about it, I don't think Alan Wake is so much a character for you to connect with, as he is a vehicle for the real main character, Remedy Entertainment. Every one of their nods and winks and moments of self-aware cleverness are invitations to connect directly with you. This, then, is also part of Alan Wake 2's success. The cheeky interplay between character, player, and developer, and Remedy's ability to make the player feel like they're in on the joke, even sometimes at the expense of the characters in the fiction.
Much like Alan, I struggle with how to end this story. I don't have some grand conclusion or unifying thesis here, except how fortunate I feel to have been on this journey from the first game in 2010 through to now, and whatever else Remedy decide to put out in the future. But I guess it is weirdly fitting that it took a game series about a writer breaking through his writer's block to help me break through mine. See what I mean about this game just worming its way into your thoughts and your real life? No!
The content creator sat on the chair, pretending not to hear the voiceover. She knew the credit sequence was self-indulgent, but she couldn't break the prison of her own self-aware cleverness. She wondered why she always left the funniest bits of her videos until the end, which nobody ever watched. The charade of gratitude appearing and then fading across the screen, like her own channel's fading success.
Hey, do you mind? I'm trying to focus here.
Sorry,